It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of moment seasoned professionals recognize instantly. The office felt calm on the surface, yet decisions had already been sealed elsewhere. I was called in without ceremony and offered a chair I did not need. The air carried certainty, not discussion. Fridays are chosen for endings because they limit resistance. I understood then that the week was not concluding naturally. It was being cut short deliberately. He spoke carefully, using words polished by business school confidence. There was no accusation, only assurance that progress required change. 8 years of coordinating payroll across 4 states became a line item, simplified and diminished. The mention of automation hovered like an insult disguised as innovation. I listened without protest, because experience teaches when speaking adds nothing. In that room, intelligence was being measured by software familiarity rather than responsibility carried. I watched his expression closely and saw relief rather than doubt. He believed he had solved a problem, not removed a safeguard. Men in their 40s recognize this look instantly. It belongs to those who mistake confidence for competence. Logic had left the conversation quietly, replaced by ego wrapped in efficiency language. I realized the decision was not about payroll. It was about proving authority in front of invisible audiences. When the meeting ended, I did not argue or negotiate. I thanked him, stood up, and gathered my tools slowly. Every movement was deliberate. Calm unsettles people more than anger. As I walked out, I felt no loss, only clarity. Systems survive on memory, not optimism. He believed knowledge lived inside files. I knew it lived inside timing, judgment, and quiet habits learned over years. That Friday closed with handshakes and assumptions that the story was finished. It was not. I drove home aware that underestimating experience carries consequences that unfold slowly. Payroll is not numbers. It is trust, rhythm, and accountability intersecting under pressure. Removing the person who understands those intersections does not simplify the system. It exposes it. At that moment, restraint became my advantage. Silence became preparation. What followed would not begin with noise or conflict, but with absence. And absence, in complex systems, is always noticed eventually. Experience has patience. It waits while confidence rushes ahead. By Monday morning, the clock would start revealing what had been dismissed, and the people who laughed would learn the cost of certainty over time slowly. People only saw reports and clean summaries, neat rows that suggested control and order. What they never saw were the nights spent rechecking figures when crews were still pouring concrete under floodlights. One wrong adjustment could stop a site cold by sunrise. Responsibility at that scale settles into your bones. It follows you home, into sleep, into weekends. Numbers stop being abstract when thousands of livelihoods depend on them. Experience teaches consequences arrive quietly, but always demand payment later eventually. They never saw the early morning calls with union stewards, voices low but tense, balancing respect and urgency. A delay explained poorly can become a strike explained loudly. Every conversation required precision, not dominance. Listening mattered more than authority. Agreements were built minute by minute, based on trust earned long before conflict appeared. Spreadsheets do not hear tone or hesitation. People do, and they remember who treated them fairly when pressure rises and patience disappears without warning signs overnight quickly. Payroll at that level is not accounting in the narrow sense people imagine. It is risk management layered with human understanding. Timing matters as much as totals. Paying late costs more than paying wrong once. Negotiation happens constantly, often invisibly, smoothing rough edges before they cut. The system functioned because judgment guided every adjustment. Experience knows when to bend and when to hold firm without explanation learned through years of pressure, mistakes, accountability, repetition, and responsibility carried daily quietly alone. Formulas are obedient, but they are also blind. They follow instructions without context or memory. When conditions change, they wait to be corrected. Judgment anticipates change. It notices patterns forming before they become problems. I adjusted numbers based on weather delays, supply shortages, and labor fatigue. None of that appears in software tutorials. It lives in experience earned through repetition and accountability, not certification measured across seasons, crises, deadlines, responsibility, trust, pressure, silence, and consequences over time patiently endured repeatedly. What 8 years built was not a system you could download. It was continuity. It was foresight shaped by failure and correction. Reports only capture outcomes, never the decisions that prevented damage. When judgment is removed, fragility enters quietly. I understood that before I ever left the building. What I carried out was not bitterness. It was knowledge of how absence reveals value slowly and without mercy to organizations that confuse tools with understanding learned through responsibility and time invested. The rollout happened fast, almost celebratory, as if speed itself proved intelligence. New dashboards appeared overnight, polished and confident. Meetings shrank from hours to minutes, trimmed of debate and context. Decisions sounded elegant, decisive, final. Slides replaced conversations. The room filled with nods instead of questions. I watched approval circulate without resistance. Simplifying complexity felt like victory to them. They mistook reduced discussion for clarity. In reality, they had only shortened the path to error. Confidence grows easily when nothing has pushed back yet. Experience was absent, quietly replaced by optimism that had never survived pressure before inside real systems. I had witnessed this stage before in other organizations chasing efficiency headlines. Early success creates an illusion of mastery. People stop asking who carries the risk when numbers shift. They trust templates more than instincts. Each clean report reinforces belief that complexity was unnecessary all along. No one questions what has been removed. Experience warns that silence often signals vulnerability. The more confident the room becomes, the less prepared it is. Assumptions settle in comfortably, unchallenged, waiting for reality to introduce itself. That moment always arrives without warning, usually after applause fades and responsibility returns to people least expecting consequences. The new system demanded trust, not understanding. Managers leaned back, satisfied, believing risk had been engineered away. I noticed how questions disappeared from agendas. Corrections were no longer discussed, only logged. When something fell off, it was postponed instead of examined. Clean processes discourage curiosity. I sensed strain building beneath the surface, subtle and ignored. Pressure does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly while confidence expands. By the time discomfort appears, options have already narrowed significantly. That narrowing locks decisions in place, leaving little room for judgment once consequences finally demand attention from people accountable for outcomes later alone. I understood then that failure rarely begins with malfunction. It starts with belief. Tools function exactly as designed, following assumptions without question. When those assumptions are wrong, damage spreads politely. I felt intellectual tension settle in, the calm before testing. Nothing had broken yet, which made confidence louder. Experience teaches patience at this stage. You wait, observe, and let certainty outrun caution. When reality finally speaks, it does not negotiate. It simply exposes what certainty chose to ignore. By then, explanations arrive too late, and those responsible realize simplicity never eliminated responsibility, it merely delayed the moment accountability became unavoidable. As Monday approached, the atmosphere shifted in ways most people missed. Emails slowed, replies shortened, confirmations stopped arriving automatically. The usual end-of-week coordination faded earlier than expected. From the outside, operations still looked orderly, calm, under control. Schedules were published, systems logged green indicators. Managers went home confident. Yet silence replaced rhythm. Experienced people recognize that silence differently. It is not peace, it is suspension. Work continued, but without alignment. Small gaps appeared between actions and responses, invisible to charts but obvious to anyone who had lived through fragile transitions before quietly warning of deeper strain ahead soon. Inside the process, signals began misaligning subtly. A supervisor waited for approval that no longer came on time. A payroll adjustment sat pending overnight, unnoticed by automated checks. Coordination relies on anticipation, not confirmation. When anticipation disappears, friction multiplies. Phones stayed quiet because everyone trusted the system to alert them later. That trust delayed human intervention. Pressure accumulated where responsibility had been distributed too thinly. Nothing looked broken, which made the situation dangerous. Mature professionals understand this phase well. Stability becomes assumed precisely when vigilance is most required. Experience teaches that warning signs whisper long before failure speaks loudly enough. I watched patterns rather than outcomes, because outcomes lag reality. Delays move minutes first, then hours. Questions were asked twice, then quietly dropped. People adjusted individually, not collectively. That fragmentation matters. Systems depend on shared timing. Without it, small inconsistencies compound quickly. The dashboards still smiled, but the ground beneath them shifted. Experience teaches that dashboards reflect yesterday, not the present moment. Pressure hid in handoffs, approvals, exceptions. Nothing demanded escalation yet. That absence of urgency felt familiar. It was the same calm that precedes every institutional stumble I had ever witnessed across large organizations before consequences surface unexpectedly later. By Sunday evening, the quiet felt heavier. I knew what mornings reveal after confident weekends. Systems do not collapse dramatically. They expose weakness through confusion. People arrive unsure who owns which decision. Responsibility blurs. Accountability stretches. Monday would not begin with alarms, but with hesitation. Experience teaches this final truth. When coordination fades, authority becomes reactive. The system had not failed yet. It was preparing to teach. What explains itself through absence always arrives slowly, then all at once, demanding attention from those who believed stability had already been secured permanently without testing assumptions under real operational pressure first properly. The first problems appeared quietly, almost politely, as if asking permission to exist. An overtime entry did not align with site hours. A supervisor waited longer than usual for approval. Nothing dramatic enough to escalate. These details were dismissed as normal friction during transition. Yet small issues matter in large systems. They signal imbalance before damage becomes visible. Experience teaches that disruption begins with inconvenience, not disaster, and those who ignore it mistake patience for stability. Overtime disputes surfaced next, framed as misunderstandings rather than warnings. Crew leaders called twice for the same clarification, unsure which version applied. Approvals moved slower, then stalled briefly, then resumed without explanation. Each delay forced someone to improvise. Improvisation multiplied quietly across departments. Payroll depends on shared certainty. When certainty fractures, people protect themselves first. That protection looks like hesitation, duplicated questions, and defensive communication that spreads confusion without intent. Soon supervisors began documenting instead of trusting. Emails replaced calls. Copies multiplied. Accountability blurred. The system still produced outputs, but effort increased sharply to maintain them. That is how systems bleed. Not through collapse, but through inefficiency draining confidence. Unions noticed patterns before management did. They always do. Their attention sharpened as complaints aligned across sites. What once felt isolated began forming a narrative. Trust erodes faster than budgets, and once questioned, it demands proof rather than reassurance. This was never revenge. No hand pushed events forward. Gravity simply resumed its work. Removing understanding from a system creates a vacuum. That vacuum fills with assumption, fear, and self-preservation. People follow rules more rigidly when judgment disappears. Ironically, that rigidity causes more exceptions. Each exception requires intervention. Intervention requires experience. Without it, delay becomes policy. Pressure builds invisibly until patience runs out. By the time leadership acknowledged the bleeding, momentum had shifted. Questions no longer sought clarity, they demanded accountability. Meetings grew longer again, tense rather than efficient. The system had not failed outright, but it had lost credibility. And credibility, once damaged, costs far more to restore than it ever did to maintain. The lesson was unfolding slowly, exactly as experience predicts. Complexity had not been eliminated. It had been ignored. Now it was reclaiming attention, one unresolved issue at a time. No one celebrated this moment, but seasoned professionals recognized the pattern and understood consequences were no longer theoretical, only delayed and quietly inevitable. The audits arrived quietly at first, framed as routine reviews meant to reassure stakeholders. Spreadsheets were requested, then explanations, then reconciliations no one had rehearsed. Emergency calls replaced polished slide decks. Managers who once spoke confidently now asked cautious questions. Efficiency suddenly carried a price tag measured in hours, penalties, and credibility. Every request exposed another gap between assumption and reality. Meetings stretched longer, not because answers were complex, but because responsibility was unclear. Institutions do not panic immediately. They investigate, document, and escalate methodically, allowing pressure to rise while everyone pretends control remains intact. Conference rooms filled again, this time with legal observers and compliance officers instead of strategists. Audit language replaced ambition. Risk assessments overshadowed innovation. Decisions slowed as signatures multiplied. Each department defended its process, not its outcome. No one referenced the past transition openly, yet its shadow sat in every discussion. Data was questioned, timelines challenged, exceptions highlighted. Institutional pressure works this way. It forces organizations to confront what confidence ignored. The system was still functioning, but now it was being examined under a lens that cared less about intention and more about exposure. I was not mentioned because names are irrelevant at this stage. Institutions search for absence, not individuals. Accountability moves toward what is missing, not who left. Reports compared current outcomes to historical baselines. Variance widened. Questions sharpened. Someone asked why informal adjustments no longer occurred. Another wondered why exceptions increased despite automation. These were not accusations, only realizations forming slowly. Pressure does not accuse. It accumulates evidence. The more data they gathered, the clearer the outline became of a role that no system had truly replaced. By the end of that meeting, the room understood something without saying it aloud. Efficiency had removed a safeguard, not waste. Emergency measures followed formal pathways, escalating costs and reputational risk. Calls were scheduled, committees formed, and timelines extended. No one looked relieved. Institutional memory was being reconstructed through paperwork rather than experience. This is how organizations learn expensive lessons. They do not admit mistakes, they absorb consequences. Accountability always returns to the missing piece, not out of malice, but necessity. When understanding leaves a system, pressure eventually guides attention back to where it once lived. That realization settled heavily, reshaping priorities, conversations, and authority, reminding everyone that institutions remember losses longer than victories and adjust behavior accordingly over time once pressure exposes structural gaps clearly. When the phone finally rang, I did not reach for it immediately. The screen lit up with a familiar number, one I had memorized through years of routine responsibility. I let it ring, listening to the sound echo across a quiet room. In that pause, I measured distance, not miles but meaning. Calls like that arrive when urgency replaces confidence. They do not ask, they request. I understood exactly why it was happening, and that understanding removed any need to hurry towards someone else's problem again. Experience taught me restraint long ago, earned through consequences, patience, and hard-won perspective daily. At that moment, there was no satisfaction waiting behind my silence. Satisfaction belongs to younger instincts. What I felt was clarity. Clarity removes noise and leaves choice. I knew returning would mean fixing symptoms, not causes. It would mean explaining lessons learned slowly to people who only listen when damage speaks first. I had already invested enough of my time, judgment, and energy building something stable. Walking back would undo that boundary and place me inside a cycle that only activates respect when systems fail. Experience teaches that pattern, and wisdom chooses distance instead of repetition and regret later again. People assume power looks like response. They believe silence means uncertainty. That belief belongs to environments driven by immediacy. I learned otherwise. Silence creates space for alignment. It forces institutions to solve problems without leaning on familiar weight. Every unanswered ring shifted responsibility back where it belonged. I watched from a distance, not emotionally, but analytically. Decisions slowed. Language softened. Authority recalibrated. When help is withheld, priorities reorganize. That reorganization reveals value more honestly than any negotiation. I was not absent. I was positioned correctly, allowing the system to confront itself without interruption, dependency, or convenient shortcuts masking responsibility temporarily. At this stage of life, control is quiet. It does not chase recognition or resolution. It selects timing carefully. I chose silence because presence would have diluted the lesson. Places that value you only when pressure peaks do not change. They repeat. I declined repetition. By staying still, I preserved ownership of my time and standards. The space I kept became my leverage. Not revenge, not pride, just self-governance. Silence was not avoidance. It was conclusion. When the phone stopped ringing, clarity remained. Some doors close. Others close because you stop opening them. That choice defines maturity, direction, and peace. They believed knowledge could be replaced by software, and at first nothing contradicted that belief. Reports continued to circulate, numbers still appeared on time, and leadership reassured itself that modernization had succeeded. That is how lessons begin, quietly disguised as confirmation. What followed was not collapse, but exposure. Small failures accumulated into patterns that could not be ignored. Each issue pointed to a missing layer of understanding once supplied by experience. Tools performed as instructed, yet outcomes drifted. That difference revealed a truth many organizations learned too late. What they learned was harder because it challenged comfort. Systems do not fail loudly when wisdom is removed. They strain. They hesitate. They require more meetings, more approvals, more explanations. Software executes rules perfectly, but wisdom knows when rules must bend. Without that judgment, efficiency becomes brittle. Every exception demands escalation. Every escalation consumes trust. Over time, confidence erodes not because tools are broken, but because people no longer feel protected by invisible safeguards they once relied on unconsciously. This story was never about revenge, and it never needed drama. Gravity does not shout when it pulls. The lesson emerged through consequence rather than confrontation. When experience leaves a system, the system continues forward unaware of its own vulnerability. Only later does it realize how much judgment once absorbed shock and uncertainty. That realization reshapes priorities. It shifts respect away from appearances and back toward substance. Organizations remember that shift longer than any presentation or apology. For those paying attention, the reminder is simple and enduring. Real power does not announce itself or demand recognition. It operates quietly, stabilizing complexity while others chase simplicity. It waits while confidence races ahead. Experience does not compete with tools. It gives them meaning. When the room is finally ready to understand that difference, the lesson settles permanently. Some knowledge can be documented. Wisdom must be lived. The cost of forgetting that truth is never immediate, but it is always exact. And once paid, it becomes unforgettable, guiding future decisions with humility, restraint, and respect for what only time can teach patiently. Mature professionals recognize this ending not as victory, but as alignment. Experience does not seek to return. It waits elsewhere, applied where it is valued consistently. That separation protects both sides. The system adapts. The individual moves forward. The lesson remains intact, steady, and useful for those willing to listen before pressure forces understanding.